So I want to speak about a certain controversial quote that Neville gave and a contradiction from his earlier work to his later work. And this topic stems from a live stream I did on Friday last week. And just to get out the way, I do one-on-ones, I do live streaming, and I have a book out. If you're interested in those things, just go to the description. It's all there. So this contradiction basically is coming from this idea of changing others versus changing self. And how should I go about this idea? And if you read it in its context, it does kind of make sense what he's saying, but he does evolve his conception of self. That's how I would say it. And I'm going to give my take on it. I'm not going to read every single quote because they're pretty long, but if you want to read this, just go to Reddit. Again, in the description, it's there. I'll link it, and you can read all the Neville quotes. I'm going to paraphrase them here just to save some time, because really it's more about, you don't have to read every single word. It's more about what the idea he's trying to say that is controversial and contradictory. So basically, this all starts from a quote from Prayer and the Art of Believing in 1945. So this is his earlier work. He's basically saying that prayer is dependent upon your attitude, not really the attitude of the subject you're trying to change. So he's saying that, but here, this is where the controversy comes in. He's saying that if you imagine for another, but that other cannot imagine that thing you're imagining for another person, then it gets rejected and it gets sent back to you. So, and the example he gives is actually malice. So he's saying if you imagine maliciously towards another, but that person cannot imagine maliciously towards another person, they can't imagine that thing towards another person, then it gets sent back to you. And in this time, he's basically saying that if it cannot be subconsciously accepted by that person, then it gets sent back to you. Now, you can see why this is a problem, because how can you really have faith in something if the other that you're trying to imagine for can reject it, right? How can you really believe something's done if they can reject a state? And this really comes down to how you see other people. If you see other people as simply figments of your imagination, then logically there would be no rejection. But I'm going to get into that later, the idea of seeing people as figments. But if you see people as having free will and having their own will just like you, then technically, yeah, they would be able to reject what you're saying. Again, this kind of is a contradiction, because how can you really have faith in your imagination if really it can rebound, it can be rejected, and all these things? But I think what he's really trying to say in this, and from my perspective, is that he's kind of just hinting at the idea that what goes around comes around. And you can kind of see how this makes sense, because if you imagine maliciously towards people, you're opening up the door to malice inside of you. And you become what you're conscious of. And if you continue to become conscious of malice, then you will start to take upon the nature of what you're conscious of. This isn't really up for debate. This is kind of factually true. Like, you'll see this in people when a certain group of people focuses on hating another group of people, that group of people will start to become what they hate. This just starts to happen because we naturally become what we're conscious of being, or what we're being conscious of. And if you start to imagine evil upon others and maliciousness, you're going to start to create that because you're creating that inside of you. You're going to start to create that in your life. So don't be surprised if what you're conscious of starts to form in your world, good, bad, or indifferent. And really, he's trying to get people to not imagine maliciously. That's basically what he's doing in this section of time. And you can think of it that since we're one, to harm you would be to harm myself. So here in 1945, he's speaking about subconscious rejection. He's speaking about rebounding. And he's speaking about not imagining maliciously towards people. And basically, if you imagine maliciously towards people, basically don't be surprised if it starts to happen in your life as well. But then 3 years later, he says this. He says, I thought I could change others through effort. Now I know I cannot change another unless I first change myself. To change another within my world, I must first change my concept of that other. And to do that best is to change the concept of myself. For the concept I held of self is the reason why I saw the other as I did. And that was in 1948 in the 5 lessons. So here he's basically saying that if I want to see people more beautifully, more lovely, in a higher light, then I start with seeing myself that way. And this just makes sense. And he's saying that this is the best way to change your world, is by changing yourself. And obviously that makes the most sense, right? Why would you go around trying to change everyone around you but yourself? And he's saying the reason why you're even seeing things the way they are is because of yourself, the concepts you hold of you. And this goes back to the idea of seeing people as figments of your imagination. In order to see people as figments of your imagination, to this logic, you would have to see yourself that way, because you are what you behold. And when I hear people say that people are just simply figments of my imagination, very rarely do I actually believe them because they actually believe that, because they don't live that way. Remember, Neville says that our real beliefs are what we live by. Unless you're really living as if people are your figments, then you're not really believing it. Like, people don't marry figments. People don't argue with figments. People don't, debate with figments of their imaginations. So they're not actually believing that. And in order to see people as figments, on some level, you'd have to see yourself that way. And usually people don't. So I kind of just crossed that off, that's not the way to really go about doing this. It's not about demeaning people. In order to demean somebody, you would have to demean yourself, because we're one. And this goes back to the scripture of Matthew 7:2, where he says, "For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. With the measure that you use, that measure will be measured to you." So again, the way I judge another, I will be judged that way too, because I'm judging myself. It's coming from me. So again, this was 3 years later. So according to this, Neville, that if you want to change your world, you want to change others, the best way to do it is to change yourself. Now, this stayed consistent throughout his life, which is there's no one to change but self. But we're going to get into what self means later, okay? Because he does kind of change the idea of what you and I would think of self. And so a great example of this idea of no one to change but self is when he imagined himself out of the army. When he imagined himself back at home living a normal life, he didn't try to change anyone else around him. So here in 1972, he's explaining the situation that happened back in 1942 and 43. During this time, he got drafted into the army and he wanted to get out. But when he went to go sign for being removed from the army, he got disapproved. And then he said, I didn't fight the colonel. I simply rearranged the structure of my mind. And he basically decided to sleep next to his wife. He did his daily activities with his daughter and his wife back at home in his imagination. Even though he was sleeping next to 25 men around him, he said, I wasn't sleeping around 25 men. I was sleeping back at home. And I did this. He said he did this, and then he had a vision where the idea or the letter that came in underneath the door said disapproved. It scratched it off and said approved. And then 9 days later, he spoke to the same colonel that rejected him and is basically giving him reason after reason why he should stay. And Neville just didn't, he was convinced he didn't want to stay anymore, he said. And so he said nothing in response to his pleas to get him to stay. And eventually the same colonel approved him. Now, what changed? Did he change the colonel? No, he changed the structure of his mind. He did not change anyone else around him. He didn't feel defeated because the colonel wanted to keep him. That same colonel changed. That same colonel he was probably set on keeping every single person in his army. And yet he changed because Neville changed, not because he made him do anything. Neville changed himself. He rearranged the structure of his mind. And so in this case, he changed reality best by changing himself, not trying to change the colonel's mind. He didn't sit down and think, how do I get this guy to basically see me or prove it for me? He didn't go to anybody else, he says. I didn't go to anyone else. I didn't go to a higher rank. I didn't plead with anybody. I simply went to myself and saw myself freed. So the world tried to put him into a state of being a soldier. And he said, I'm not taking that state. I'm going to put myself in the state of being free. And the world has to conform to the state that I'm in because I have to receive myself. And if that takes changing the colonel's mind, then so be it. It'll change the colonel's mind. And so he didn't change anyone. He simply changed himself. So he's not making people do things like they're puppets. He's changing himself. And by that, he receives himself in the world. And in this case, it happened to change the colonel's mind. He changed everything around him shifted that led him to receiving his imagined self, which is back in New York. Now, in the same book, Prayer and the Art of Believing, he says that fools exploit the world, the wise transfigure it. So he's saying that this is the best way he's found to change reality, which is by changing himself. You can exploit it. You can force it, but it's foolish. The best way is to transfigure yourself, to change yourself, because you're intrinsically tied with yourself, right? I mean, that you and your life are intrinsically tied. So if you want to change your life, the best thing to do is to change how you view yourself. Now, he told his army story in 1972 in the lecture, Rearrange Your Mind. But this actually happened back in 1942 and in 1943. And then 2 years later, he wrote that book, Prayer and the Art of Believing, in 1945, where he speaks about the subconscious and then rebounding and rejecting, etc. But then later in his teachings, he shifts it over from all those things to failure. He actually speaks about failure. And it's a failure in what? So he's saying that, like, if you want to imagine somebody different, now we're coming back to changing people. If you want to imagine somebody different, he's not going to speak about rebounding anymore. He's not going to speak about rejection. He's saying if you are self-persuaded that they are the image that you want them to be in, if you're self-persuaded of the reality of it, then they will start to conform to it. He says that, let's say it's somebody who's really rude. If you start to imagine themselves respecting you and you're persuaded by this, they might be rude to somebody else, but they'll respect you. And then he goes on to say that if you want to change someone and if you want to put them in a new state, and if you become self-persuaded that they are that state, they will start to conform to it. But he says what happens typically is we hear they did something, or we hear some rumor about them, and then we change the picture of what or the image that we had for them, or the state that we had for them, and we revert back to the way we saw them, or even worse. So he says don't change the picture. Still stay true to it. Remain faithful to the image you have for them, and they will start to conform to it. So now he's speaking about this in 1969, the idea of self-persuasion and failure to be self-persuaded. And this is 24 years later than after writing the book, Prayer and the Art of Believing. So failure in this case is if I fail to persuade myself that I am already the one I want to be, then I will have a failure in expressing it. Now that just makes sense, right? If I'm not actually convinced that I am what I want to be, then I will never see it. And that's why he says that your refusal to believe that you already are it is the only reason why you don't see it. So this is now coming back to self, but in the form of self-persuasion and in the form of failure. So there's no longer rebounding and there's no longer rejection. It's simply persuasion, specifically being self-persuaded. Now, I said I was going to come back to the self. So self in this context is much different than the self that we had in the past. When it came to Neville in 1945, if you asked him, I want to change somebody, he would give you this answer of like, well, the other person might not accept it, yada, yada, yada. But in this case, he's saying it's all about self. Now, self is not the little ego that he's talking about. He has a far greater conception of self in this case. He has a far broader view of self. In this case, self is equal to imagination. So we all live in our imaginations, and what we're persuaded as reality in imagination will become our reality. And so to reverse it, reality is self, and self is a collection of persuasions in imagination. So what creates reality is what we're persuaded reality is in this world of imagination. So self is a collection of persuasions. What am I persuaded by? That will become my reality. So when he says there's no one to change but self, he's right. But in this case, he's broadened the idea of self. This is why Neville was so adamant on the idea of believe in the reality. Believe in the reality of your imaginal act. Feel its reality. Make it feel real to you. This is why he was so adamant on this idea, because you can go inside yourself and you might bump into certain states that you want to be, but you don't actually believe them. You're not actually persuaded that you are that thing. You're not persuaded that they are that thing. So it always comes back to self-persuasions. What are you persuaded by in this world of imagination? So even though we live in a physical world, we are also living in a mental one. And I'm calling this mental space imagination. And in this imagination that we all kind of collectively live in, you are convinced of certain things in this world that's real, different than me. But Neville is saying, can you be persuaded that the one that you want to change, that they're changed? Can you be convinced that the way you want to change, you're changed? Can you persuade yourself? Failure to persuade yourself is a failure in its expression. So really there is failure, but it's always coming back to the context of persuasion. So did Neville change his mind? Did he discard what he said? In a sense, yes, and in a sense, no, and I'm going to get into no in a second. But he did discard the idea of rebounding and rejection and the idea of the subconscious mind. He stopped speaking about that entirely. And he discarded the idea of the other. He calls it the seeming other. And he replaced it with self, with a greater view, a broader view of what self is. Not just my little insecurity, but like whatever I'm convinced of inside my imagination, that's myself. Whatever I've been persuaded by to be true, that's self. It could be about others and it could be about me. So we have moved from rejection to, am I remaining faithful to the image that I'm holding of this person? Am I remaining loyal to this reality, this inward reality? And this is what it means when God says he calls things that are unseen as though they are seen. So I go inside myself and I see something that is unseen by people's eyes. Yes, it's unseen, but do I believe in the reality of it? Can I make it real to me? And am I persuaded by the reality of this thing? Then that's what will start to be reality in my world. And so you can see how it's always coming back to self now. It's not checking on the person to see if they've conformed and getting frustrated that they haven't conformed yet. It's asking myself, I'm coming back to self, am I remaining loyal to this image? Do I see them in a higher and lovelier way? And a good way to do that is by starting with yourself. Start seeing yourself that way. And when I said that, in a sense, yes, and in a sense, no, he didn't discard it. Because the context of rebounding came from malicious intent. Even up to his death, he spoke about following the golden rule. And the golden rule is simply do unto others that you would have them do unto you. Now, he says this is just basic common sense to follow it. And that love is the answer. That it solves it all when you imagine within love, which is the golden rule. And of course, there are many people who are going to reject the golden rule. You don't have to live by it, obviously. You can just turn on the news and you'll see that nobody's living by it. But this is where it comes back full circle. Because what I've noticed for me is that when I see other people trying to change other people, they usually get very angry that the other person isn't conforming. And these people are usually upset because they don't have full control of other people. But the thing is that they wouldn't want someone to have full control over them. So they're doing unto somebody that they don't want done unto them. And so what they wish for people, they don't want done to them. And when you imagine that way, you have opened the door to this for this to happen to you as well. And that's why I don't think you should ignore the golden rule. I mean, you could ignore it and not give it another thought, but it's just common sense. And when you start to live upon it, you realize it's not about being perfect or holy. It's just that. It's common sense. What I want: riches, love, freedom, respect, joy. What's wrong with that? There's not a thing wrong with it. So I have no issue imagining that for somebody. But if you come to me and ask me to hear a change for somebody, and that's harmful, and you want me to imagine their demise because that would make you happy, I won't do that. If you wish for me to break up families, marriages, and friendships out of spite, I won't imagine that for you. Neville did the same type of rejection to people. People would ask him to hear certain people are dead, and he would reject their request. He had a certain moral code that he would live by, and so do I. So Neville at this time might have been morally conflicted with the use of this law, as so am I. So I've had many people come to me with certain requests that internally I say, no, I'm not doing that. That's not something I would follow. It kind of goes against my moral code. Now, everyone has their own moral code, but try your best to live by it. So rebounding and rejection and evil and malice, these are things are solved by love. That's why Neville would say, whenever you don't know, do the loving thing. What would I want done for me? Do unto others that you have them do unto you. I mean, it's a very simple law. Or a simple rule. You don't have to follow it. It's not a law you have to follow. It's a rule. And it can be seen as that if I'm harming another, I'm harming myself because we're all one. And I've seen too many times in my life where people imagine maliciously. They fill their whole minds up with malicious intent towards other people. And they do start to receive the maliciousness that they're imagining. I've seen it too many times for me to ignore it. And the way they judge people maliciously, by that measure, they're being judged as well to themselves. So it just makes sense to try to follow it. Try to imagine success for other people and imagine good for other people. Because you're essentially also doing that for yourself because you're creating that within you. So personally, I think people who take issue with the golden rule really are people who want to imagine a certain way that they wouldn't want done to them. And they want to justify it and find reasons to continue imagining that way. But if you really came down to it and you ask yourself, what I want this done to me, and the answer really is a definite no, then I wouldn't do it personally. So I think when it came to rejection and rebounding, I think the controversy is, necessary because I think Neville does contradict himself with that. I do. But if you see it in its context, he's really trying to say, don't imagine maliciously in a really in a convoluted, kind of strange way. But he's really saying, try to use this work lovingly the best you can. And you will create a better life if you do that. But it's clear that people can imagine all sorts of evils, but don't. Like there's no need to. Always try to frame your imaginal acts in a loving way. So really, to me, this contradiction, what I see is Neville evolving his idea of self. He's expanding it. It's no longer just a little self. It's a much larger view of self, and it's really one with his imagination and all that he's persuaded by in his imagination. So even though there was a contradiction, I think the arrival point was similar, which is to believe in the reality of loving things in imagination, whether it's for you or the seeming other. Okay, so that was me somewhat reading it and somewhat going back and forth through reading it and speaking. Now this is me speaking about it. So I totally think this is a justified contradiction to speak about. And because on the one hand, how could you really trust in what you're imagining if the other person can reject it? But if they can't reject it, and by your persuasion, you can assume it to be true, and you can start to become persuaded by the reality of it, and it starts to become reality. Do the loving thing. Try to do. If someone is in need of help, imagine they've been helped. See them from the position that they've already been helped. As Neville always gave the example of being unemployed, you start to see them gainfully employed. You have a friend who's in poverty, see them having more money. Do the loving thing. Would I want more money if I was in his position? Yes. So I try to follow that to the best of my ability. It's not really about, I've had people try to argue with me about morals and how they're subjective. It's like, yes, I understand that, but we can all collectively agree that not many of us would want to eat dog shit for dinner, right? We all kind of have an idea. Although taste is subjective, we all have an idea of what tastes good. It might, waver here and there, but for the most part, we understand. So I think it's really not hard to follow the golden rule. It's kind of simple if you see it as like, it's not about being holy. It's just, of course, if I was in a great position of need, I would want, to be helped. So I'm going to imagine that way. It's pretty simple. But I think the requests I've gotten kind of are shocking to me. And I start to, maybe this is what Neville was going through as well, where you kind of hear certain people request things and you're just like, I don't agree with that at all. And I don't want to imagine that way. And maybe this is what he was trying to do in his early, maybe he had a moral confliction with it. And I have felt that as well. I've been morally conflicted about certain things too. And I've tried to let it go and say, well, I can't always know what's right and wrong. But if I follow the rule, it kind of clears it up for me. At least it gives me more of an idea. So when you imagine, I urge you to try to go within the golden rule. What I want this done to me. And it should give you an answer, at least give you some idea of what route to take. Because when you start to create malice or you imagine in ways that you wouldn't want done to you, you are opening those doors inside of you. And I don't think that's wise. I don't. I think it's always wise to imagine the loving thing for yourself. You will feel better. You will feel more light. You will know that you did the loving thing within you. And when you start to do more and more of those things, they start to come into your life as well, because you're becoming conscious of it within yourself. You're becoming persuaded by the love inside of you. You're no longer living from doubting it or feeling that it's too far off. So again, I think the overall message and arrival point, although maybe the way he talked about it and the contradiction here and there, maybe he took a step here and took a step there, but really the route was the same. It was believe in the reality of loving things in imagination. Be persuaded by the reality of them, whether it's for you or the seeming other. And the main point I wanted to hit is that his evolution of self is what grew. It's his idea of self. That self is a collection of persuasions in imagination, whether it's about you or the world or other people. And so, again, start to become persuaded of the loving things inside of you. You'll find yourself living a much better life that way. And it's just common sense when you see it that way. And so I'm going to end that one here. I don't want to make this too long, but I hope I brought some clarity. And, it's okay to talk about these contradictions. You see Neville kind of be consistent towards the end of his life. That's why I always recommend reading the end of his work. I think it's he does have a greater sense of self in it, and it's hard to catch sometimes, but when you see it in the context, you'll see what he means by self and why it comes down to what you're persuaded by. That's your idea of self. And he does say that, the self is a collection of states. So yeah, I'm going to end that one here. I don't want to make it too long, but I do hope that this has provided some clarity that if you're going to change people, you're going to change yourself, become persuaded of the reality of it. That's the way to do it. And do your best to make it loving for yourself and the seeming other. And so I don't mind talking about this in the future again. I don't have to just make one video on it, but I don't want to make this one too long. And I wouldn't mind diving actually a bit deeper into it. Maybe I'll make a few more videos on this. But again, thank you for listening and take care.